So as Joanne said, my name is Leo Mora, and over the past 6 weeks I've had the distinct pleasure of working within Dr. Ital Levy's Decision Neuroscience Lab on a project seeking to investigate the decision-making processes of combat veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and compare results to what is known about the average healthy population. More specifically, using a decision economics task, we sought to identify participant attitudes towards two components of uncertain decision-making, risk and ambiguity, as well as identify the neural correlates of subjective value through functional MRI. Now, what is PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder is defined as a mental health condition that can occur after a traumatic event like war, assault, or disaster. Its symptoms include emotional numbness, self-destructive behavior, irritability, aggression, trouble sleeping, and trouble concentrating. Now, contrary to common belief, PTSD is an extremely common condition throughout the world. In fact, every year there are over 3 million adult cases of PTSD in the United States alone. As well, 6.8 of every 100 American adults will contract PTSD at some point in their lifespan. Additionally, PTSD is a major issue in the United States military. Of those that served in the Afghanistan war, an estimated 11 to 20% suffer from PTSD in a given year. Additionally, of those that served in the Iraq war, an estimated 19% suffer from PTSD in a given year as well. Now, of the 2.7 million United States military personnel that served in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, an estimated 405,000 suffer from PTSD. Now, all of these statistics serve to answer the basic question of why the Levy Lab is seeking to investigate the decision-making processes of those suffering from PTSD, because it is a growing problem with many negative social repercussions. Now, the objective of our investigation was to use a behavioral economics framework, which I'll explain later, for studying a widely ignored aspect of trauma-related symptomology. It's linked to individual uncertainty attitudes. Now, this leads to the hypothesis of our investigation. Neural activation patterns in individuals with PTSD differ from controls when they are faced with ambiguous losses, but not when non-ambiguous losses or ambiguous gains are considered. Now, in simpler terms, until the vocabulary in red can be explained, the basic hypothesis of our investigation is that the highly ambiguous, risk-filled nature of combat has hindered the ability of these soldiers to make uncertainty-filled decisions. Now, at the Levy Lab, we seek to understand the decision-making processes, the two main components of decision-making when uncertainty is involved: risk and ambiguity. Now, a tangible example of risk from the context of our experiment is as follows. Imagine you're on a road trip with friends, and the only food that's left is a measly Twix bar. The most logical way of deciding who gets the food is to flip a coin. There's a 50% chance you'll get heads, and a 50% chance you'll get tails. Now, this is a prime example of risk, because the probability of each example is known, 50-50. Now, in contrast, here's an example of ambiguity. Where I live in Holland, no one knows anything about basketball. So if you asked a random dude on the street, hey, who will win the NBA Finals between the Warriors and the Cavaliers? Their answer will most probably be, I have no idea. That's because to them, it's an ambiguous question. The probability of each outcome is unknown. Now, to evaluate participant attitudes towards risk and ambiguity, we used a very simple economics choice task. We had subjects sit in front of a computer and execute a choice between two monetary options. First and foremost, on the left-hand side, was a fixed monetary quantity, which did not change from trial to trial, plus $5 in gains trials and minus $5 in loss trials. On the right-hand side was a lottery, which with two potential monetary outcomes. In this case, there's a 75% chance of getting $0 and a 25% chance of getting $52. Now, each trial was characterized as either gains or loss, potential monetary gain versus potential monetary loss, or risky and ambiguous, containing lotteries with known outcome probabilities versus lotteries with unknown outcome probabilities, respectively. Now, each subject completed a total of 240 trials. Now, the lottery consisted of a bag on the screen, colored partially red and blue. Subjects were told that each bag contained 100 poker chips, some red and some blue. One possible outcome of the lottery was consistently $0, while the magnitude of the other monetary option was one of 21 different amounts, ranging from $5 to $120. And the specific monetary quantities we used can be seen below. Now, here's an example of a trial a subject might see involving monetary decision-making under risk. The subject will have to execute a choice between the two. On the left-hand side, a sure gain of $5, or a lottery on the right-hand side. In this case, there's a 75% chance of getting $0 and a 25% chance of getting $52. Here's an example of a trial the subject might see involving monetary decision-making under ambiguity. In this case, the subject can choose between a sure gain of $5 or risk the lottery. In this case, the probability of each monetary outcome has been obscured from the subject via what is known as the Gray-Luder bar. Now, in the general population, most people are risk-averse. In other words, most people will tend to choose the sure gain of $5 rather than risk the lottery. Also, people tend to be ambiguity averse. In other words, people tend to choose the lottery with no probabilities, in this case 50-50, rather than the ambiguous lottery, even though the payoff could be higher, in this case $110. Now, we had subjects complete our procedure in two different settings. First and foremost, in the lab in front of a computer, and secondly, within what is known as an fMRI scanner. Now, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or functional imaging procedure using MRI technology that measures brain activity by detecting associated changes in blood flow. And fMRI advantages, and the reason they're used so often in clinical studies, are as follows. 1, it is non-invasive and doesn't involve radiation, making it safe for the subject. 2, it has excellent spatial and good temporal resolution. And 3, it is easy for the experimenter to use. And here's a picture I took of a subject undergoing our procedure at an fMRI scanner in this building, in fact. So what happens is the subject goes into the fMRI scanner, and we project our economics choice desk into a screen in front of them. And they can choose between the two monetary options via a clicker in their right hand. And here's an image of the computer system that processes the images captured by the fMRI scanner. You may all be wondering, what was I up to during the course of this investigation? What was my personal role? Well, the answer is simple. I was doing what is known as fMRI pre-processing. And here's a photo of me at action in the lab. We have fun in the lab, just so you know. And so basically what I would do is take images captured by the fMRI scanner and process them in a software known as Brain Voyager. So I take the fMRI files and run a sequence known as a rigid body motion parameter. So what this would do is correct for the minute movements the body makes when inside an fMRI scanner. A movement as small as 5 millimeters can corrupt fMRI images and render them unusable, potentially, to a study. So that's where I came in. Here's an image of a complete rigid body motion parameter. So no longer will the movement of this subject's body affect our study. It's been now completed. And although this investigation will take another year to complete and is still ongoing, I can share with you all our preliminary results. In the graph to the left-hand side, the y-axis represents the degree of aversion in subjects, and the x-axis represents the ambiguity level. The red columns represent combat controls, those not suffering from PTSD, and the pink columns represent those indeed suffering from PTSD. In the graph to the right, the y-axis represents averse versus seeking behavior, and the x-axis represents ambiguity level. In the gains domain, the graph to the left, both groups demonstrate ambiguity aversion that increases with higher levels of ambiguity. In the loss domain, the graph to the right, the control group displays ambiguity-seeking attitudes, while the PTSD group displays averse attitudes. In other words, those that suffer from PTSD, in generally, run away from ambiguous decisions. In the graph to the left, the y-axis represents averse versus seeking behavior, and the x-axis represents gains domains and losses domains. Combat control subjects, those who do not suffer from PTSD, were mostly ambiguity-seeking, while the PTSD subject had an average averse attitudes. This is a major difference in the way that PTSD sufferers and healthy individuals deal with decisions and uncertainty. Now, the neural correlates of risk and ambiguity are still being evaluated, but what I can say is that I have found neural activation patterns in cortical areas highly linked to decision-making and PTSD, such as the OFC region of the brain and the ACC. Now, before I conclude my presentation today, I'd like to thank you all for your time and patience and acknowledge certain members of the crowd. First and foremost, Dr. Gilmore for the fantastic opportunity of being here. Ms. Joanne Billiard for organizing everything and making our lives so much easier. Dr. Yafat Levy for welcoming me into her lab. And Dr. Latal Ruderman for being so patient with me, explaining, giving me her time, and making my experience a great one. And most importantly, the Levy Lab for just being awesome and always helping me to laugh and feel welcome. And last but most importantly, in my opinion, family and friends for providing me love and support whenever I needed it. And before I conclude my presentation, I'd like to give a shout out to a very special member of the audience, my mom, who flew all the way from Utah to see my presentation. So, if you will.